Attention, please. The show starts in 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go.
Greetings. We're going to kind of start tonight with a slightly different flow. So I want you to hear a little bit from Queen Mother Dr. Chinzero about having a purpose. Just a little. Freedom. We need freedom. Oh, yes, I want freedom. I want freedom. Have a purpose in all you do. Just make sure that your purpose is true. Have a purpose in this here life, so your life ain't fall astray. I live a purpose each and every day, so we can live in our way. I have a purpose in all you do, just make sure your life is true. Just wanted to kind of start tonight slightly different than we customarily do with our speaks, building a new legacy, and especially since the month of May is also a number of observances. So I'm going to start with the observances that I'm most familiar with. African Liberation Month. Every May, and we're going back to 1958. And I just want people to pause on that. There were so many things happening in the African continent, so many things happening in America, the Americas plural, so many things happening throughout the Caribbean and the world that were uplifting people of African ancestry, literally globally. But it had a very powerful start. And tonight, I just would like to give a very concise overview, something that we have done in previous podcasts, but I think it's really important to just keep people remembering that when we speak of African liberation, we are speaking of the total liberation, unification of African people in a very clearly scientific, technologically uplifting social structure. Some people feel that it needs to be socialism. Some people want to go into these other terms, communism, elevated capitalism, whatever term, but let's be specific. We're talking about social systems, structures that support the upliftment of people of African ancestry, which, by the way, is global. I'm going to let you ponder on that thought. So I want to also highlight that when we talk about African liberation, Day. We're speaking of what started as Africa Freedom Day on April 15th in the 1950s and elevated as different African nations, various Caribbean nations secured their independence from European colonization, right? It's very clear. If people want to go, you can look at the work of the Honorable Osajifo, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, who was the first president of the independent sovereign republic of Ghana. Don't believe me? Do the research. This is a time where we get a chance to talk about persons like Patrice Lumumba, who, although he was assassinated most horrifically before really getting an opportunity to serve and lead as president of the Congo, left a legacy around African liberation. I want to pause for a moment because I can go down this list of others, because another elder at that time who was already an emperor, already identified through historic record as the King of Kings and the Lords of Lords, as the conquering Lion of Judah, the Honorable Haile Selassie I, alongside Her Imperial Majesty, Empress Menan Asfal of Ethiopia. These are the elements of persons, the characters of persons with power and sovereignty that were the grounding, the foundational thrust, push with the people globally for African liberation. So, again, Africa Freedom Day, April 15th, elevated to African Liberation Day, May 25th, every year. And that shift was between 1958 and 1963. So let's remember what was going on in other parts of the world between 1958 and 1963. So it gives us an opportunity to look at how the civil rights movement was moving, how Jim Crow laws were being dismantled, how various civil rights movements were spreading like wildfire, like human rights activities, how apartheid in South Africa was being questioned, how the question of Israeli occupation, more specifically Zionist occupation in spaces like Palestine, things that are still happening, manifested and influenced what was happening inside of the African liberation movements, plural. I don't want to just say it was a singular movement. It manifested very differently in different parts of the African world. And again, I speak of it in a global context. What was happening in the Philippines under Spanish colonialism? How were, what was the impact of the removal of a queen in the state, what is now a state of Hawaii? Just think about these things. These were things were happening around this same period. And she was forced off of her throne. And then ultimately, this same area that we know as Hawaii, as a state, as a part of the United States of America, is part of the Union. And I have no problem quoting: "We, the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare at hand, secure the blessing of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish that Constitution of the United States of America." When you have a preamble like that, some of these things that we're talking about, some of these acts of oppression, repression, colonization that were racist, sexist, classist, and purely anti liberation, especially for people of African ancestry, they should have never happened. So I just share all of this in that short amount of time just to give people a grounding and opening for some of the things that we should be more familiar with. And I like to give people the opportunity to look at different sites. So you can easily go and look at certain spaces online. Look at anything that's being brought forth by the Universal Negro Improvement Association, African Communities League, UNIAACL, the Garvey Movement, RC 2020. Look at their website, and you will get an opportunity to see some of these things that are linked to African Liberation Day, how it's linked to observances that go as early as the 1920s, right? So persons get an idea. This is not something that just kind of popped up. It's not trendy. These are things that are institutional. These are things that are historic. These are occurrences, observances, commemorations, not just celebrations. You don't just celebrate certain things. Yes, you can celebrate independence if it's authentic. But if you're still under the thumb of another sovereign entity, which is something that is experienced by existing colonies of America, of Britain, of France, Spain, Portugal, and the list continues, then that means that we need to reassess how we commemorate and observe African Liberation Day every May. And since African Liberation Day is specifically on identified as May 25th, and there's been a lot of shifting because some persons, specifically Africans within the continent, all 12 million square miles, maybe not all 12 million square miles, but a good portion, many of the leaders have already identified themselves as having sovereignty. And in many instances, many do. Hmm. So I'll pause on that one and ask you to reflect, if you're sovereign, how can an external sovereign nation define what your military can do, can define where you can deal with your economic trade and commerce, can define whether or not you are allowed to provide visas for persons that are not part of your sovereign country? Or even better, have a military base on your in your country where not even your nationals can go. For those that aren't aware of where that exists, I'll just use an example here in the Caribbean: Cuba. Guantanamo Bay should no longer exist like it exists. There's no part of the US, maybe I could be corrected on this, where a external sovereign nation has complete autonomy inside of any part of the 48 states, the two non contiguous states, or its five colonies that are not American. So reciprocity is really important when we talk about African Liberation Day. So let me get to the other portion that I really wanted to highlight tonight as well, because this is something that's really dear for us. There's many persons that remember, the development of the Organization of African Unity, and this was, brought together by the heads of state. At the time, it went from eight to more than almost 3 dozen independent African nations in like a 5 year period. And I think the persons need to take some time, look at the work, as I mentioned, whether it's of the work of Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. You can look at the work of Leopold Senghor. You can look at the work of Dr. Julius Nyerere, Leopold Senghor, and but you want to look at the work of Dr. Julius Nyerere, Tanzania. And I think there's so many others that you can begin to read. Or just look at any African history material, whether it's Dr. Yosef Ben Yakanan, Dr. John Henrik Clark, any of these pieces, that any of these authors have work that provide like a chronology of what transpired in the middle of the 20th century, coming into, let's say like about 1940s. Look at the time, around the time where the League of Nations was formed and where there was a Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. And while that Declaration of Human Rights of 1948 was going on, there was still Jim Crow laws in this space called the United States of America. And the United States of America was participatory in this Declaration of Human Rights. Hence, the thrust for African liberation. And that's why it still continues to this day, that there are observances. This is tied to so many things, but I want to give a little fun fact, because persons remember all of the men, and sometimes we forget the sisters, the women, the aunties, the grandmothers that participated, were the artivists, activists, revolutionary thrust, with their children wrapped to their back, with their children holding on to their hands, with their older children walking with and being part of this movement. What came before the Organization of African Unity, that was formed in 1963 formally? In 1962, there was the formation of the Pan African Women's Organization that still exists, PAWO. And I think it's really important, and their charter day is July 31st. I think it's really important. There are a number of things that are happening every year. For example, they have activities. They always have representation at the United Nations. They participate with the Commission on the Status of Women, along with other anti violence against women and young children activities and programs around the globe, focusing, as women customarily do, health, human services and security, agriculture, education, economic sustainability, climate issues, environmental affairs. That's just what we tend to do because we're mothers, whether through the birthing process or by the nurturing and the maternal process that is part of our charge as women. And so it's really powerful to know that PAWO, Pan African Women's Organization, was formed actually almost an entire year before the formulation, and it had a significant contribution and grounding for the development of the Organization of African Unity. I think it's really important for us when we talk about African Liberation Month in the month of May, when we speak about African Liberation Day, and even right here in the Virgin Islands, which is always a surprise to many persons, we have an observance that has been in our Virgin Islands Legislative Code, the law, from 1989. And what's interesting is it was introduced to the legislature at that time earlier in the year of 1989. In 1989, in September, the Virgin Islands was decimated, more than 95% destruction from Hurricane Hugo. All of the Virgin Islands, St. Croix, St. Thomas, St. John, Tortola, Virgin Gorda, we can go on, British side and the US side. So it was very interesting that even in the midst of all of that, there was a development made to highlight the importance of having observances for Virgin Islands, making the third week of May of every year Virgin Islands African Liberation Week, and raising the African Liberation flag, the red, black, and green flag. And that goes back to Marcus Garvey's movement, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, African Communities League, the UNIA, from 1920. And here in this small community that is a non incorporated, non self governing territory of the United States of America, colony, Virgin Islands African Liberation Week. And on that 25th, that by law, the African Liberation flag is raised on the Capitol grounds of the legislature. And originally it was done in our main legislative halls in the Isle of St. Thomas. And over the years, it's been done on the legislative halls, which are on St. Thomas, where the Capitol is now in Charlotte Amalie, and also here in St. Croix. I just need people to be clear that it wasn't and it didn't require revolution. It actually required policy lobbying and the composition of a very well thought out legislative policy that went through the halls of Virgin Islands legislative councils and was approved. I just think people might forget that because sometimes I think people think that we're making these things up. And I want people to just, or that it's a personal thing. And I think that that is so far from the truth because even, I think it's interesting that some people, the act, for those people that want to know, is 5473. I think that you can easily go to Justia Law and you can see that for those persons that might question what happened. I think that it's also important, and I want to read it just for the persons in the back that think that this is like a whatever. But you can go to the U.S. Virgin Islands Code, Title 1, General Provisions. Chapter 11, Holidays. Section 192, Virgin Islands African Heritage Week. Thank you for the correction. And African Liberation Day. So I appreciate that people are watching this and making sure that I'm saying what I'm saying correctly. But I want to read what is in the code. The third week in May shall be observed as Virgin Islands African Heritage Week, and the 25th day of May shall be observed as African Liberation Day. At least 15 days prior to Virgin Islands African Heritage Week, the governor shall issue a proclamation calling on all residents to join together in appropriate ceremonies to reflect upon our African heritage. C, the governor shall appoint a committee each year to coordinate with the African Appraisal Workshop. I'll put an asterisk to that one because there's a different formation in 2025, and other interested community groups, and develop appropriate plans, programs, and ceremonies for the celebration of African Heritage Week in the Virgin Islands. The D, this is the part I want to highlight. The legislature on African Liberation Day, remember that's May 25th, shall hold appropriate ceremonies on the grounds of the Capitol Building, Charlotte Amalie St. Thomas. Such ceremonies shall include the raising of the African Liberation Flag. These aren't my words. This is in the code. And I think it's really important for persons to recognize. So when we're talking about African liberation, we can talk about the celebratory part, we know about how we're going to dress, and we talk about all the music and the dance, and it's fabulous. It's important to know the history. It's important to know, since everyone likes to talk about law and what's policy and what's in place, and this still exists in our Virgin Islands Code. And I think it's important to know some of the legacy builders that were instrumental to this. So whenever I see these types of codes and initiatives, it makes me also highlight all of the different organizations, of which there are many, that remain contributory to this. So all of the different African, Pan-African, Black African, African West Indian, African Caribbean, indigenous initiatives, organizations, policymakers come together to be able to highlight African Liberation Day, and in the case, Virgin Islands African Heritage Week, because it gives us an opportunity to pause and reflect on what led up to the international designation of African Liberation Day on May 25th. And one of the organizations that has been instrumental to hosting and work and collaborating quite internationally is the All African People's Revolutionary Party, an organization called for, initiated through the leadership and efforts of the Honorable President of Ghana, Osagyefo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, and others. And people forget that it's an international organization. This is something that I always encourage people. Just put in AAPRP, not AARP. Make sure we correct ourselves. We're not talking about the over 50 organization. We're talking about the All African People's Revolutionary Party, which still exists. That still has cadre. That still has organizers that specifically look at Pan-Africanism and the definition presented and promoted by Dr. Kwame Nkrumah as Pan-Africanism being the total liberation and unification of Africa under a scientifically socialist government. Very specific, very clear on not being supportive of, and the term you may hear is Aba, or down with, capitalismo, Aba, imperialism, Zionism, apartheid. Very specific, very specific. And I think it's important for persons, because we've covered it quite a bit in a short amount of time. But I didn't mean to go that fast, but I got excited. It's been a lot going on in the region. There's a lot going on in the African world, and I definitely just like to use this opportunity for persons to just get a slice, a snippet of so many different things that are taking place. While we're honoring African Liberation Month, it is also a significant opportunity to honor and celebrate this time where many of our youth and the not so young, from elementary to secondary to tertiary, university, college, and even post secondary, are engaged in promotional exercises, graduations, earning diplomas, commencement exercises, acquiring from associates to baccalaureate to master's to PhD, MD, LLM, JD, SJD, and a bazillion other degrees. I'm sure there's more letters than I've shared here. And we want to send a resounding congratulations to all of the graduates and promotees for the class of 2025. I wanted to pause because even here in the Virgin Islands of the United States, at the University of the Virgin Islands on our Albert A. Sheen campus today was our commencement exercise for the class of 2025. And beautiful to see the families and community come together and celebrate. I think we should start having more graduations and commencement exercises. Maybe we just need to just have them like once a season. Just a thought, just a thought, so that people can come together and celebrate and acknowledge the achievements, the great gifts that we are being blessed with, and seeing people move from one stage of their academic development or vocation, academic, I include vocational as well as different layers of the traditional collegiate space, because we had so many opportunities. Like the month of May, while it's African Liberation Month, yes, globally, here in the Virgin, like from the beginning of the month until I believe the last graduation we have here is going to be shortly after, right before African Liberation Day. So it's like almost 25 days of commencement exercises, promotional exercises, graduations throughout our community. And I'm sure this is happening because we see what's going on in the rest of the 48 contiguous inclusive, and I must add, of course, Hawaii and Alaska, right? And all of the spaces that are still working through being territories or commonwealths: Puerto Rico, Mariana Islands, American Samoa, Guam, and of course the Virgin Islands. I just think it's important that we just take a minute and just give thanks and celebrate. And I'm going to give a shout out. She probably didn't think I would do that in the middle of my broadcast, but I'm definitely giving a shout out to our visionary, none other than Sister Queen Angela, on her commencement exercise for her master's degree. I want to, in the midst of doing all of this, with broadcasting, podcasting, research, publication, I just really want to acknowledge you and celebrate you as well, because I think it's important that we do that and take those moments. And if I missed out on anybody else's in our team's achievements, graduations, etc., and even if it's your grandchild or your auntie or your, your uncle or one of the children in the neighborhood, we're celebrating them too, because this is a time. It's really important that we do these things and honor these life shifting, transformational achievements when we can, because it's not always about the distractions of death or hurt and negativity. We would like to be able to celebrate these threads of the achievements of our families, within our families, around our families, in our communities, around our communities, to the best of our ability. So, like I said, I'm just extending congratulations to all of the graduates that are celebrating during this particular time from latter part of April, probably moving all the way into the month of May, all the way to the 31st. So just wanted to highlight that. I think it's also important sometimes to, now that I've done that part, I want you to hear this song. This is my infomercial, right? So I have had the honor and privilege of being part of a fabulous community, part of a very regal and royal community as a Queen Mother in the Pokomo Nation in Kenya. And through the honorable clearing given to me and the blessings bestowed upon me by His Royal Majesty King Dr. Makarani Mungasi VII, who, by the way, is also a dean in the School of Medicine at Pwani University in Kenya. That's the sidebar, important sidebar. But through his efforts in helping communities doing humanitarian work, supporting African liberation in all ways possible, supporting global connectivity that restores peace, provides justice, and of course, the what did we say? Promote the general welfare at hand, those things. All of that. I think it's important that we talk about how is this done through music? How is this done through the arts? So we have the joy and privilege of meeting who a number of artists, but specifically when we were welcomed a couple of years ago, and whenever we do return, we get an opportunity to hear about a young artist, Fred Abio. And I encourage you, Fred, I know we know that term, Abio, Abio. I encourage you to go to YouTube, just put in his name, and you'll see the diversity that we have in young artists. And this particular artist hails out of Kenya. And I think it's important. I just wanted you to just hear part of what he shared. Enjoy.
Tumekuja kuwaimbia nyimbo za tana, tumekuja kuwachezea dansi za tana, tumekuja kuwaimbia nyimbo za tana, tumekuja kuwachezea dansi za tana. Afro Country. Mara ya kwanza mi ufika shaka babo, moyo lijawa na furaha, korogami kama nufu ya mamba na mpumi humbika na mramo nikashia kunisumuye. Sikwa magara piyetiwe mamojoni wanjia wa malanshini ni wapangia ni mpaka Holani laza ni chia tena ni kwanoni apio kanchiza usumuye kiako usumuye papa ajure achana usumuye kiako usumuye papa ajure achana tanakuna mpala wasi tanakuna ngwena wakuyu tanakuna vintu vichamu
As you could tell, we can listen to this music all day. And actually, I'm really encouraging persons go to YouTube, Fred Avio, and you can put in Husamue. And it's, let me get the proper spelling so that for those persons that might save it, Husumue. And he's also featured with a string artist on strings, Afro Country. That's who you were hearing. They were speaking between themselves. And this was a song that welcomes you to the community. So you may have heard them saying Karibu, and then they were saying the names of the persons that were coming into the village. And when you hear Hajila, that's me. That's my friend. And I'm really grateful that we were able to just listen briefly to part of that selection. And there's a number of other selections that that particular artist has. And again, I share these things because we're saying we're highlighting African Liberation Month, and there's so many different elements that are tied to that. And I always encourage my sisters and brothers to go to some of these websites to learn specifically about these observances. Don't just take what people show at you, or definitely don't just think that it's only what's available in social media. There's a study vibe. You know how we used to have like book clubs? Well, I think there's still some that exist, but a lot of times, the intention is so that we're studying together. I guess now it's scrolling, but for some of us, especially at least in my youth, we had different study groups. Inside of the AAPRP, there was work study, is work study. Let me be more specific. In other organizations or groups, it may be that you may read around things that are specific to your area of specialization, whether it's naturopathy, health and wellness, legalese affairs, human rights, artisans, craftsmanship, construction, agriculture, architecture, whatever it is, astronomy, whatever it is, it's important for us to study and to know more specifically in a first-hand form to be able to speak about certain things. So I encourage persons, I've said it, you can go to AAPRP-intl.org. For those persons that aren't familiar with the All African People's Revolutionary Party, when you go to the site, don't lean back. Just know that this is an organization that has a legacy, a history beyond a half of a century. So it's just that you just didn't know right now, but you probably have been around persons that have been around the AAPRP. There's other organizations like the UNIAACL. Just put in Garvey, and you will find a host of materials, publications. If you don't want to read a whole lot of books, because many of the books are very long, they're coming in audiobooks now. But you also can see films, short films. There's a really lovely short film on just getting a thread of who the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey is. It's a piece that is referred, and it's actually done by a brother who currently resides in, well, before I say that, I know him to have a studio and his affairs in California and the West Coast. And Brother Shaka Satori has really honed in on providing a 7-minute video that provides a scope of that history that again is tied to African liberation around the life and contributions of the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey. And I encourage persons, the whirlwind, just Google. These are things that you can find. And I usually I put a whole lot of these things inside of our space. If you're interested, send an email to Ast Speaks, ASTSPEAKS. Again, AST as in tomorrow, speaks, SPEAKS, at gmail.com, right? If you lose your way and you're listening inside of YouTube, then place your requests inside of the chat. If you're inside of the Facebook space or another space, put your request in the chat and the information will be made available to you in less than 48 hours. And I say 48 hours because we have another graduation tomorrow. And then we have weekends and we're preparing for the 100th anniversary of the birth of the Honorable Malcolm X. So all those people that thought they remembered May 19th, exactly, 1925. And there are a whole activities are being organized around the globe. There's more activities. Usually I can keep up, but this time absolutely not, because there are observances, honoring his centennial of what would have been his 100th birthday all around the world. And I think it's important to know and learn as much as we can, because again, his birthday is literally what, 6 days before African Liberation Day. So it's all connected. It's all connected. And there are a number of things that happen on May 19th. And there's a number of persons that we need to acknowledge and observe as well. That list is long. If you're interested in knowing more about that, feel free, as I said, ozspeaks@gmail.com or in any of our platforms that are here, because this is why we offer this kind of information on Oz Speaks broadcast here within our crew, because it's really important for persons to know how we navigate through these spaces of freedom, these decolonization, reparatory justice, reparations, restitution. There's a lot of different R words, but more specifically, how do we uplift ourselves and remain uplifted? How do we reclaim our sovereignty even in the midst of chaos? This is not the first time that people of African ancestry have endured challenges in societies, in called civilizations. This is not the first time. And prayerfully, we always like to say this will never, people like say never again. Notice people aren't saying that right now. That's not the main thrust. Our thrust is to thrive, not just survive, not just die for the revolution, but live for the revolution. Live through the revolution, not just truth as power, as one of our eldresses here, Dr. Alethea, shared with us, but to authentically acknowledge truth as power. That's a little different, because then the principles we speak of truth, justice, order, reciprocity, balance, divine righteousness, and harmony, have to say all of that. But in our ancestral, ancient African Nubian Kushyan Kemetu heritage legacy, our Ankh legacy, our eternal life, our grounded life legacy, we use 4 letters: Ma'at, M-A-A-T. All of that, a feminine principle representing and reflecting the qualities, the character, the practice, the admonitions, truth, justice, order, reciprocity, balance, divine righteousness, and harmony. And again, this is all tied to what people, and again, we can have conversations. You spell Africa Africa, Afrika, Afraka. Do you do Afro wherever you from? Do you do Afra wherever you from? African American. We have a lot of things that we're still working through, because it was intentional for us to have distractions and institutional chaos and systems that did not facilitate our ability to just stay firm in Ma'at, to stay grounded in divine intelligence, Shahuti, to move beyond what everyone is AI, artificial intelligence, outside of ancestral intelligences, plural. It's not singular, right? And these are the types of things that we get a chance to really highlight, celebrate, and share when we have opportunities in these respected podcasts to bring truth as power, to recognize what are the things that we can do in ourselves that are transforming our communities, transforming our families a bit at a time. We're not perfect. Our imperfections are wide and great. But if we knead it, like how we prepare bread or put it on the potter's wheel and hewn it well with sacred intentions that are positive, that are uplifting, that are healing, that restore joy, that support liberation and unification, and even the integration of technologies that honor human life, not dismantle human life, not destroy the character of our people, not mismanage and harm our children, our women, our men, our families, our communities, but things that actually allow us to live life well, live life with joy and prosperity and a liberty that is honorable in the sight of our ancestors, embraced by the Almighty Creator, by all the names that we use. There's always the opportunity to share when we speak of prayers, meditation, reflections, affirmations, and bringing our groundings when we speak of things, whether it's African liberation, whether we talk about the observances for different great achievers, our historic, epic, iconic brethren and sistren. I remember learning pretty young about women in Nigeria in the 50s, well, actually in the 40s, coming into the 50s. Again, a precursor to what took place leading up to African Liberation Day as an international observance. And the women that gathered, the market women, that at one point there was a class thing between the more elite, trained, educated, more wealthy women of Nigeria and the quote common market woman that may not have gone to school or may have more children than 2.5. And these women back in the 20th century came together. I think it's really important that we remember these things, and it makes me remember hmm, the Honorable Queen Mother Funmilayo Ransom Kuti. And I'm going to pause on that one, and I encourage persons to find out about some of the work, the revolutions, the movements that were spearheaded by women that many people don't talk about. Think about Carlota in Cuba. Find out about her. Find out about Queen Mary and them, because it wasn't just Queen Mary, it was Queen Mary and them. Many women that led the fire burn of 1878 in St. Croix. It was a labor rebellion that people still talk about today. Talk about Queen Dreflin, who led an African revolution in the smallest island, well, now not the smallest, but back then the smallest isle in what was then the Danish West Indies, in St. John, in 1733, and strategically had a military that kept that island in the heights of enslavement and human trafficking, slavery, what they like to call it, in 1733, and held that island as a free African space from November 1733 until May 1734. I don't think most people learn these things. And then we can go in a more suavemente space and look at one of the earliest. I tend not to say the first because as we do research, we find out more. one of the earliest nonviolent, successful, I want to highlight, nonviolent protests, no blood, in the Isle of St. Thomas, right on Main Street, the same Main Street that when people come to St. Thomas, they just think sun, sand, sea, and fun. But that same Main Street, there was a protest led by women, supported by men, but led by women. And one of the leaders of that particular protest was a woman named Queen Keziah. That is 1892. And I share these things not to make this too academic, but just so that we begin to unfold. This is a time, what did Ida B. Wells do that was so profound to address things around lynching in the 48 contiguous US and to establish institutions that we're still grounded with in the 21st century? We talk about Sojourner Truth, but did we really go into the truth of what Sojourner Truth did and how she led? That's all part of African liberation. Harriet Tubman, of course. Amy Ashwood Garvey and Amy Jacks Garvey. Henrietta Vinton Davis. I could do this all night. And I just encourage us. Who are the African liberators that you like to add to this list? Share them with us so that we can do some study and honor and celebrate different persons around African Liberation Month. And throughout the year, we could do this every day and find more persons. I would just like to encourage as we close out tonight. African Liberation, we speak of the day, May 25th, annually. We speak of the Virgin Islands African Heritage Week here in the Virgin Islands by the Virgin Islands Code. The third week, it's usually it's usually like the 18th to the 25th or thereabouts. Usually it's like from the Sunday. In this case, it will be from the 18th. Let me make sure I correct myself. Yes, it'll be from the 18th to the 25th. Yes. And we get a chance to really celebrate and honor African liberators that influence not only the Virgin Islands, not only the Caribbean, but the world. Yeah. This is a great time for us to do that. We don't have to only limit ourselves to Black History Month in February in the west of the Atlantic, in October to the east of the Atlantic, right? We do this 365 days, 366 days when it's leap year, 24/7, because there's a lot that needs to be learned. And there's a lot also that needs to be unlearned so that we honor ourselves, that we respect ourselves, that we can be healed, that we do not allow distractions of who did what to who and who's still trying to do what to who. This is our time to gather our resources in economic spaces, in psychological spaces, in emotional spaces, in spiritual spaces for us to authentically transform and grow and be whole. So that's what I'm going to be doing throughout African Liberation Month. And it's going to continue because June, we get to talk about National Caribbean American Heritage Month. I don't think that has been dismantled yet, or maybe they don't know that that exists. So prayerfully, we're going to get to talk about that in June in our forthcoming podcast. So again, it's been an honor and a privilege to share here on Oz Speaks with our beloved crew. Remember that there's the Aspiring Authors Magazine, LLC. There's been recommendations. Do those stars, because while we do all of this work, there is a cost. And reciprocity is part of Ma'at. So don't just come with the truth and the justice. Notice I said truth, justice, order, reciprocity, divine righteousness, and harmony. And that reciprocity comes in a variety of ways. It's resourcefulness. It's how we exchange, how we give currency as we receive currency. When people are giving, it's important for us to receive, and that continues right inside of our own susu. What do you call it? Hand. Whatever term you use for how we keep our resources to keep us strong, to keep us balanced, and to keep us harmonized. So, with that, we know that culture heals humanity, land is our foundation, and spiritual harmony unifies us. We give thanks and praise for those that were able to join in, tune in, and listen. Again, this has been Queen Mother Dr. Chinsera. I am excited on what you're going to offer and share with us around the African liberators that we need to include in future podcasts right here. Just remember, you get an opportunity to give just as we give an opportunity to receive. And we're very grateful for everyone's contributions, their sharing, and much, much more. I'm looking forward to the opportunities that we will share. And if you have other questions, please feel free. Email me, aspeaks, ASTSPEAKS, at gmail.com. Look for us on YouTube as well as inside of all social media. If you really want to get to me directly, then I encourage you to do so in that form. I'm probably the only Queen Mother Chenzera in most platforms, and that's another option. So, again, enjoy your evening. I'm looking forward to everyone remembering their purpose and sharing with us how we move this forward. Keep that energy forward. Keep your purpose. Hotep and blessings. Good night. Freedom. We need freedom. Oh, yes, I want freedom. I want freedom. Have a purpose in all you do.